The weight of my grandfather's gold watch had never felt heavier than it did that Tuesday morning, 24 hours before my parents would be living on the street. I held it in my palm, feeling the smooth metal warming under my touch, watching the second hand sweep around the face in perfect rhythm. The same rhythm it had kept for 67 years, through my grandfather's wars, through my father's childhood, through my own 18 years of believing that some things were too precious to lose. But everything has a price, even the priceless. And sometimes the cost of keeping what you love is losing everyone you love. The pawn shop owner had quoted me $12,000 over the phone. Enough to stop our eviction, catch up on 3 months of back rent, and maybe keep the utilities on for another month or two. Enough to save my parents from the shame of homelessness and give us time to figure out something more permanent. All I had to do was walk into that shop and trade away the last connection I had to the man who had raised me to believe that a black man's word and a black man's legacy were the only things this country couldn't take away from you. The watch had been my grandfather's retirement gift to himself in 1956, purchased with money he'd saved from 15 years of working double shifts at the steel mill in Pittsburgh. Back then, a gold Omega Seamaster cost more than most black men made in 3 months, but Grandpa had dreamed of owning something beautiful, something that proved he was more than what society expected him to be. A watch, he told me when he passed it down on my 16th birthday, is the only honest thing in the world. It doesn't lie about time. It doesn't make promises it can't keep, and it treats every second like it matters. Wear it like you understand that your time matters too. In my hands was everything my grandfather had given me. Not just gold and gears, but the belief that I came from people who built things to last, who saved and sacrificed and planned for futures they might not live to see. In 24 hours, it would belong to a stranger who would never know that it had once measured the heartbeat of a man who refused to accept that his grandson's future was limited by the color of his skin. But keeping the watch meant losing my parents. And I was about to learn that sometimes honoring the dead means making choices the living can barely survive. My name is Marcus Johnson, and I grew up believing that some things were more valuable than money. In our house, family history wasn't just stories, it was artifacts. My grandmother's wedding ring passed down through 3 generations of women who had worn it through poverty and prosperity. My great-grandfather's Bible, with handwritten notes in the margins documenting prayers answered and faith tested, and my grandfather's watch, ticking steadily on my wrist like a reminder that time was precious and legacy was permanent. Grandpa had lived with us from the time I was 7 until he passed when I was 16, and those 9 years had shaped everything I believed about manhood, responsibility, and what it meant to be proud of who you were. He was the one who taught me to tie a tie properly, to look people in the eye when I spoke to them, to understand that respect was earned through consistency and character. Every morning, he would wind that watch with careful precision, the same ritual he'd performed for decades. Punctuality, he would say, is respect made visible. When you show up on time, you're telling the world that other people's time matters to you. He had worked at the steel mill for 38 years, rising before dawn 6 days a week, his hands growing harder and his back growing weaker, but never missing a day unless he was literally unable to stand. The watch had been his reward for decades of showing up, for proving that a black man could be as reliable and valuable as anyone else in that mill. When he gave it to me, it wasn't just a gift. It was an inheritance of values, work ethic, dignity, the belief that how you spent your time determined who you became. But 2 years after Grandpa's funeral, those values felt like luxuries my family could no longer afford. My father, David, had followed in Grandpa's footsteps, working construction and manual labor jobs that paid well when the work was steady, but offered no security when the economy shifted. For 15 years, he had supported our family through skill, determination, and the kind of physical endurance that eventually takes its toll on every man who makes his living with his hands. The injury happened on a Tuesday morning in February. A scaffolding collapse that broke Dad's back in 2 places and shattered his left ankle beyond repair. Workers' compensation covered the immediate medical expenses, but the bureaucratic maze of forms and appeals meant months of delayed payments and denied claims. While Dad was in the hospital learning to walk again, Mom tried to hold everything together. She worked as a home health aide, caring for elderly clients who needed help with daily tasks. It was meaningful work that she loved, but it paid barely above minimum wage and offered no benefits. When she had to reduce her hours to care for Dad during his recovery, our family income dropped to a level that couldn't sustain the life we had built. That's when the bills started accumulating faster than the payments could keep up. Rent, utilities, medical co-pays, prescription costs, physical therapy sessions. Each month, the gap between what we owed and what we could pay grew wider, and each conversation with landlords and creditors grew more desperate. I was 18, a senior in high school with plans to attend community college and study automotive technology. I had a part-time job at a local garage, learning about engines and electrical systems while earning money that I had planned to save for school. But as our family's financial crisis deepened, my paychecks went straight to household expenses, and my college plans became an increasingly distant possibility. The watch on my wrist became more than jewelry. It became a reminder of what we used to be versus what we were becoming. Every time I looked at it, I could hear Grandpa's voice talking about dignity and legacy, about building something that would last beyond your own lifetime. But dignity doesn't pay rent, and legacy doesn't keep the lights on. Have you ever held something that represented everything your family stood for? When you realized that keeping it meant losing everything else? When you understood that sometimes the most precious things become the most necessary sacrifices? That's where I was that Tuesday morning, holding my grandfather's watch and calculating whether its sentimental value was worth more than my parents' immediate survival. The eviction notice had arrived the day before, our final warning before the sheriff's department would physically remove us from the apartment we had called home for 8 years. 3 months of unpaid rent, plus late fees and court costs, totaled nearly $11,000. Money we didn't have, couldn't borrow, and had no legitimate way to earn in the 24 hours we had left. I had researched every option I could think of. Emergency assistance programs that had waiting lists longer than our timeline. Family members who were facing their own financial struggles and couldn't help even if they wanted to. Churches and community organizations that offered limited help for utility bills, but nothing substantial enough to prevent eviction. The only asset our family owned that could generate the money we needed was sitting on my wrist, ticking steadily like a countdown to an impossible decision. That morning, I sat in our small living room surrounded by boxes we couldn't afford to pack professionally and furniture we might have to abandon, trying to imagine what Grandpa would want me to do. Would he understand that sometimes preserving the future requires sacrificing the past? Or would he see selling his watch as betraying everything he had taught me about the value of things that couldn't be replaced? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't really about the watch. It was about whether I was the kind of man who could make hard choices to protect the people he loved, or the kind of man who prioritized sentiment over survival. Grandpa had bought that watch to prove something about his worth and his future. Now I had to decide whether keeping it proved something about my values, or whether selling it proved something about my priorities. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Morrison's Fine Timepieces, the collector who had expressed interest in buying the watch when I had called 3 days earlier, hoping I wouldn't have to follow through. "Mr. Morrison," I said when he answered. "This is Marcus Johnson. We spoke about my grandfather's Omega Seamaster." "Of course," he replied, his voice warm but professional. "Have you decided whether you'd like to proceed with the sale?" I looked at the watch on my wrist, its second hand continuing its relentless march around the dial, measuring the time I had left to make this choice. "Yes, sir. I'd like to meet today if possible." The weight of the watch had never felt heavier, but it was about to become someone else's burden to carry. The address, Mr. Morrison had given me led to an upscale antique store in a part of town where I rarely had reason to visit. The kind of neighborhood where old money lived quietly behind perfectly maintained facades, where the history being preserved was the kind that celebrated rather than the kind that survived. Walking through the front door felt like entering a museum dedicated to things that had been beautiful enough to last. Grandfather clocks from centuries past, oil paintings in gilded frames, furniture that had been crafted by hand when such work was art rather than industry. Everything in the store represented someone's legacy, someone's attempt to create something permanent in a temporary world. Mr. Morrison was a man in his 60s, distinguished in the way that comes from a lifetime of surrounding yourself with beautiful things. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never had to choose between sentiment and survival. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand as I approached the counter. "Thank you for coming. I know this can't be an easy decision. I pulled the watch from my wrist and placed it carefully on the velvet cloth he had spread across the counter. Under the store's bright lights, it looked even more magnificent than it did at home, the gold case gleaming, the blue face deep and rich, the hands moving with mechanical precision that spoke to decades of careful maintenance. Morrison examined it with a jeweler's loupe, checking the movement, the case, the authenticity of every component. "This is a beautiful piece," he said finally. 1956 Seamaster, original box and papers, excellent condition despite its age. Your grandfather took good care of it. He wound it every morning for 40 years, I said. Same time, same routine. Said it was a matter of respect. Morrison looked up from the watch and studied my face. And you've been wearing it since I was 16. He gave it to me before he passed. Morrison nodded slowly. Family pieces are always the most difficult to part with. They carry more than just monetary value. He quoted the price we had discussed over the phone, $12,000, enough to solve our immediate crisis with a small buffer for unexpected expenses. It was a fair offer, maybe even generous, but it felt like he was putting a price on something that couldn't be valued in dollars. I need to ask you something, Morrison said, his voice gentle but direct. Are you selling this because you want to, or because you have to? The question caught me off guard. I had expected a business transaction, not a conversation about motivation. Does it matter? I asked. To the price? No. But to my conscience, yes. I've been in this business for 30 years, and I can usually tell the difference between someone who's ready to let something go and someone who's being forced to let it go. I looked at the watch lying on the counter, no longer on my wrist where it belonged, already looking like it belonged to someone else. My parents are going to be evicted tomorrow if I don't come up with $11,000, I said. This is the only thing I own that's worth enough to prevent that from happening. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the watch and then studying me. Your grandfather, he said finally. What kind of man was he? The best man I ever knew. Worked harder than anyone I've met. Never complained, always put his family first. He bought this watch to prove something about what he was worth. And what do you think he would say about you selling it to keep your parents housed? I had been asking myself that same question for days, but hearing it from a stranger forced me to think about it differently. I think, I said slowly, he would say that taking care of family is more important than keeping things. But I also think he would hate that I had to make this choice at all. Morrison nodded. Your grandfather sounds like he was a practical man. Practical men understand that sometimes you have to sacrifice what you love to protect what you love more. He pulled out a cashier's check that had already been filled out for the full amount we had discussed. All it needed was his signature to become the solution to our family's crisis. But instead of signing it immediately, he looked at me one more time. I want you to understand something, he said. Once I write my name on this check and you cash it, this watch belongs to me. I'll take good care of it, but it will never be yours again. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do? I thought about my parents at home, probably packing what little they could carry, preparing to ask friends and relatives for temporary shelter that might not be available. I thought about Dad's pride, about how hard it would be for him to admit that despite 30 years of working with his hands, he couldn't provide basic security for his family. I thought about Mom's quiet dignity, about how she would smile and pretend that living on someone else's floor wasn't humiliating. Then I thought about Grandpa, about the stories he used to tell about the sacrifices previous generations had made so that future generations could have better lives. About how he had worked double shifts so that Dad could finish high school. About how Dad had worked construction so that I could have opportunities neither of them had ever imagined. Maybe this was just the next chapter in that same story. Maybe Grandpa's legacy wasn't the watch itself, but the values it represented, the willingness to sacrifice today's comfort for tomorrow's possibilities, to put family above possessions, to understand that sometimes love requires letting go. I'm certain, I said. Morrison signed the check and slid it across the counter. I folded it carefully and put it in my wallet, then watched as he picked up the watch and examined it one more time. This will go to a good home, he said. I have a client who collects vintage Omegas, but only pieces with real provenance, real stories. He'll appreciate what this represents. I nodded and turned to leave, but Morrison called my name before I reached the door. "Marcus," he said, "your grandfather would be proud of you. It takes courage to make hard choices, and wisdom to know when keeping something means losing everything else." The money felt heavier than the watch ever had. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every red light felt like time stolen from the relief I was about to provide. Every mile took me closer to the moment when I would be able to tell my parents that they wouldn't be sleeping on anyone's floor, that their son had found a way to keep our family together. But it also took me further from the last physical connection I had to the man who had shaped everything I believed about dignity, responsibility, and what it meant to be proud of who you were. When I walked through our front door, Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, trying to figure out which possessions they could fit in my dad's pickup truck and which ones they would have to leave behind. They looked up when I entered, and I could see that they had been crying. Not the dramatic tears of television shows, but the quiet, exhausted tears of people who had run out of solutions and were preparing to accept defeat. "Where have you been, baby?" Mom asked, wiping her eyes quickly and trying to smile. I sat down at the table and pulled out the cashier's check, placing it carefully between the eviction notice and the stack of bills they had been sorting through. For a moment, neither of them understood what they were looking at. Then Dad picked up the check and read the amount, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a terrible understanding. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where did you get this money?" I looked down at my wrist, where a pale band of skin marked the place where Grandpa's watch had lived for the past 2 years. "I sold Grandpa's watch," I said. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom covered her mouth with her hands. Dad stared at the check like it was written in a language he couldn't read. "Son," Dad said finally, "you know we can't take this. That watch was your inheritance, your connection to my father. It was supposed to be yours forever." "It was supposed to be mine," I agreed. "But you're supposed to be my parents forever too. And if I kept the watch and lost you to the streets, what good would it do me?" Mom started crying again, but these tears were different. Not the exhausted tears of defeat, but the overwhelming tears of gratitude mixed with guilt. "Your grandfather is probably turning over in his grave," she said. "No," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "Grandpa always said that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for the people he loves. He would understand." Dad stood up from the table and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than any hug we had shared since I was a child. When he finally let go, his eyes were red but his voice was steady. "We'll pay you back," he said. "I don't know how or when, but we'll find a way to get that watch back for you." "Dad," I said, "you don't owe me anything. You gave me 18 years of having a home, of knowing I was loved, of believing I could be anything I wanted to be. If selling a watch is what it takes to make sure you have the same security, then it's the best investment I've ever made." They were safe, but something irreplaceable was gone forever. Or so I thought. What would you sell to save the people you love? When does preserving the past become less important than protecting the future? Have you ever had to choose between keeping something precious and keeping someone precious safe? These aren't abstract questions when you're 18 years old and holding a cashier's check that represents both salvation and loss, both the solution to an immediate crisis and the end of a connection to family history that can never be restored. But sometimes life has lessons to teach that we're not ready to receive, and sometimes the people we least expect become the teachers we most need. 3 weeks after I sold the watch, I was working my usual shift at the garage when Mr. Morrison walked through the front bay door. I recognized him immediately, but seeing him in my workplace, surrounded by oil stains and engine parts and the organized chaos of working-class life, felt like worlds colliding. "Marcus," he said, approaching the car I was working on, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I got your work address from the phone book." I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped back from the engine. "Mr. Morrison, is everything okay? Was there a problem with the watch?" "No problem at all," he said. "Actually, quite the opposite. I wanted to talk to you about something, but I needed to see where you worked first." He looked around the garage, taking in the organized tools, the repair manuals, the certificates on the wall that showed the shop's certifications and awards. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. 2 years, part-time during school. I'm hoping to go to community college for automotive technology if I can save up enough money." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. And your boss? What kind of employer is he? I glanced toward the office where Mr. Henderson, the shop owner, was working on invoices. He's fair, pays me well for part-time work, teaches me things, treats me with respect. Why do you ask? Because, Morrison said, I have a story to tell you, and I want to make sure I'm telling it to the right person. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk, and after checking with Mr. Henderson, I followed Morrison to a small diner across the street from the garage. Over coffee and pie, Morrison told me about his own grandfather, a Jewish immigrant who had fled Europe in the 1930s with nothing but a small diamond he had sewn into the lining of his coat. That diamond had been the family's only valuable possession, passed down through generations as a symbol of survival and hope. When my grandfather got to America, Morrison said, he was desperate. Couldn't speak English, had no job skills that translated to this country, was living in a tenement with 8 other people. He took that diamond to a pawn shop and sold it for enough money to rent a small space and start a watch repair business. Morrison stirred sugar into his coffee and continued. For 40 years, he regretted that decision. He felt like he had betrayed his family's history, sold off the only connection he had to the relatives who had died in Europe. It aided him until the day he died. But here's the thing, Morrison said, looking directly at me. That watch repair business became the foundation for everything our family built afterward. My father expanded it into watch sales. I turned it into antique timepieces and collectibles. My son is now a master watchmaker who works with museums and collectors around the world. He paused to take a sip of his coffee. None of that would have existed if my grandfather hadn't been willing to sell something precious to build something lasting. I wasn't sure where the story was going, but I could feel that it was leading somewhere important. The day you sold me your grandfather's watch, Morrison continued, I could see that you were doing exactly what my grandfather had done, sacrificing something meaningful to create something necessary. But I could also see that it was breaking your heart. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The client I told you about, the one who collects vintage Omegas, that was my son. When I told him the story behind your grandfather's watch, about the man who wore it for 40 years, about the grandson who sold it to save his family, he said something that changed my perspective. Morrison opened the box, and inside was my grandfather's watch, looking exactly as it had when I had placed it on his counter 3 weeks earlier. He said that some things are too important to be owned by people who didn't earn them. That watch belongs with your family, not in some collector's display case. I stared at the watch, not understanding what was happening. Mr. Morrison, I can't afford to buy it back. The money you paid me is gone. Rent, utilities, debts. I don't have $12,000. I'm not asking you to buy it back, Morrison said. I'm asking you to accept it as a gift, with one condition. He closed the box and slid it across the table toward me. The condition is that you understand what your grandfather's real legacy was. It wasn't the watch. It was the values that led him to buy it and the values that led you to sell it. Hard work, family loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. Morrison reached into his other pocket and pulled out a business card. My son's company provides scholarships for young people who are interested in learning traditional trades, watchmaking, jewelry repair, antique restoration. The scholarship covers full tuition, provides a living stipend, and includes a guaranteed apprenticeship with master craftsmen. He handed me the card along with the watch box. If you're interested in learning skills that can't be outsourced or replaced by technology, that combine technical precision with artistic creativity, I'd like to recommend you for the program. I looked at the business card, then at the box containing my grandfather's watch, then back at Morrison. Why are you doing this? I asked. Morrison smiled. Because 70 years ago, someone gave my grandfather a chance when he had nothing but determination and a willingness to work hard. Because I've learned that the most valuable things we own are the opportunities we create for other people. He stood up from the table and put on his coat. Think about it, Marcus. You have my number if you're interested. And regardless of what you decide about the scholarship, the watch belongs with you. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you truly have. And sometimes the kindness of strangers teaches you more about family than anything blood relatives ever could. 1 year later, I was living in Philadelphia, enrolled in Morrison Timepiece Academy, learning the ancient art of watch repair and restoration from master craftsmen who treated precision as a form of prayer. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, housing, materials, even a small stipend that allowed me to send money home to help my parents get back on their feet. But more than that, I was learning skills that connected me to my grandfather in ways I had never expected. Every watch I repaired, every movement I adjusted, every timepiece I brought back to life felt like a conversation with him across the years. The work required the same values he had tried to teach me: patience, attention to detail, respect for craftsmanship, pride in doing things right the first time. But it also required something new: the understanding that the most beautiful things are often the ones that have been broken and carefully repaired. My grandfather's watch sat on my workbench every day, keeping perfect time while I learned to repair other people's broken timepieces. But its meaning had changed completely. It was no longer just a reminder of what we had lost, it was proof of what we had found. The apartment my parents had nearly lost became the foundation for rebuilding their lives. Dad's back never fully recovered, but he found work as a shop supervisor, using his experience to train younger workers while managing projects that didn't require heavy lifting. Mom expanded her home health aid work into a small business, hiring other caring women and building a reputation for excellence that brought steady referrals. They were proud of what I was learning, proud that their son was mastering skills that honored both tradition and innovation. But they were most proud that I had learned the difference between keeping things and keeping family together. On the first anniversary of the day I had almost lost them to eviction, I came home to Philadelphia for a visit. We sat in their living room, the same room where we had once packed boxes and prepared for homelessness, and I showed them a watch I had restored as part of my final project. It was a 1943 Hamilton military timepiece that had belonged to a World War II veteran. The case was dented, the crystal was cracked, the movement had stopped working decades ago. But after months of careful work, it was keeping perfect time again, its battle scars polished but not erased, its history preserved alongside its functionality. Sometimes, I told them, the most beautiful things are the ones that have survived the worst damage. I looked at my grandfather's watch on my wrist, ticking steadily as it had for 68 years, through wars and peace, through prosperity and poverty, through loss and recovery. Grandpa's watch taught me that time is precious, I said. But selling it taught me something more important, that the people we love are more precious than anything time can measure. Dad smiled and wound his own watch, a simple Timex he had worn for 20 years. Your grandfather always said that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for the people he loves, I finished. We sat in comfortable silence, 3 generations of lessons about time and sacrifice and what it really means to preserve a legacy. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, full of people carrying their own precious things, their own impossible choices, their own opportunities to discover what they truly value. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mr. Morrison. "How's the final project coming along?" I typed back, "Learning that some things are worth more when you've almost lost them." His response came immediately. "Your grandfather would understand exactly what you mean." 2 years after I had sold what I thought could never be replaced, I graduated from the Morrison Timepiece Academy as the youngest master watch restorer in the program's history. My final project, that restored Hamilton military watch, was purchased by the Smithsonian Institution for their collection of American craftsmanship. But the real achievement wasn't the recognition or the job offers from prestigious watch companies around the world. It was the understanding that my grandfather's legacy had never been about the watch at all. It had been about the values that made me willing to sacrifice something precious to protect something more precious. At the graduation ceremony, Mr. Morrison presented me with a special award for excellence in restoration and community service. But the presentation I'll never forget came afterward, when my parents walked across the stage to pin my boutonniere and tell me how proud they were. "Son," Dad said, his voice shaking with emotion, "you saved our family twice. Once when you sold that watch, and again when you showed us what it really means to honor your grandfather's memory." Mom hugged me tight and whispered, "He's watching, baby, and he's proud." standing there in my cap and gown, surrounded by family and mentors who had taught me that the most valuable things can't be stolen or sold or lost. I felt my grandfather's presence more strongly than I had since the day he died. The watch on my wrist kept perfect time, but I had learned that the most important moments can't be measured in hours and minutes. They're measured in choices made, sacrifices offered, and love demonstrated through actions that matter more than words. If you believe that some inheritances are meant to be spent to create new legacies, that the most precious things we own are the people we love, and that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you truly have, then this story matters to you too. Subscribe for more stories about impossible choices that lead to unexpected grace, about young people who learn that courage isn't about keeping what you have, but about knowing what's worth losing, about families who discover that their real wealth was never in what they owned, but in what they were willing to sacrifice for each other. Because that watch taught me something no classroom ever could, that time is precious, but the people we spend it with are priceless. That legacy isn't about preserving the past unchanged, but about using the past to build something better for the future. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that 24 hours can change everything, that the hardest choices often lead to the most beautiful outcomes, and that sometimes the most valuable thing you can inherit is the wisdom to know when to let go. Because some inheritances are meant to be spent to create new legacies. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people who came before you is proving that their sacrifices made you strong enough to sacrifice for the people who come after. That watch still keeps perfect time, 69 years after my grandfather first wound it with hope and pride. But now it measures more than just minutes and hours. It measures the moments when love becomes action, when family becomes choice, and when letting go becomes the strongest way to hold on.